comes out as a butterfly with 6 legs and 4 wings. How does that happen? Or a female ladybug will lay a clutch of tiny yellow eggs, and they break out into black, prickly, little, crazy-looking things. And then the larva's full grown and it's a big yellow thing. And then all of a sudden you get a red, black ladybug. How does that happen? Photosynthesis, sunlight, is absorbed by green leaves and produces glucose, nutrition. If my dad would talk about transformation, he'd say, how would a brown cow eat green grass and give white milk? That was his view of transformation. Babies are born small and grow into adults. The smallest baby was born in 2020, 7.9 ounces, and grew into not an adult yet, but after 13 months in the hospital, was able to leave the hospital. Transformation happens. Some people hear transformation, hear change, and they fear it. When railroads were first introduced in the U.S., some folks feared that they'd be the downfall of the nation. Here's an excerpt from a letter to President Andrew Jackson, dated January 31st, 1829. As you may know, Mr. President, railroad carriages are pulled at the enormous speed of 15 miles per hour by engines, which in addition to endangering life and limb of passengers, roar and snort their way through the countryside, setting fire to crops, scaring the livestock, frightening women and children. The Almighty certainly never intended that people should travel at such breakneck speed. And it was signed by Martin Van Buren, the governor of New York, who became the 8th president of the United States. Thankfully, we progressed. Change and transformation is natural. It's God's design. And it's God's design for the spiritual world as well. People who truly follow Jesus are transformed. They're changed into something different. We all made a decision to follow Christ. It might have been in Sunday school with a Sunday school teacher, or as a child with a parent, or maybe a youth group leader in high school, or in college it was with InterVarsity or Navigators or Campus Crusade for Christ, or maybe it as an adult through a neighbor or a colleague. We didn't fully understand the implications when we came to Christ. We didn't know all the consequences, all the responsibilities, all the blessings, but we were changed. A new nature, a new heart, the Spirit of God within us. We were different, and change continues to happen in us. Over the years, we've learned what it meant to follow Jesus. We've learned that it's a process. We put off the old. We put on the new. We put on the mind of Christ. We walk in the way of Jesus. Some folks grow and mature. Some folks become more like Jesus. Some folks don't. And it just seems like some folks are stuck. They give their life to Christ, but it seems like there's no change, no transformation, no emotional maturity, no looking more like Jesus Christ. Same patterns of sin. Jesus said, "Come, follow me." And when he said that, it was a journey and anticipated a transformed life, a changed life. He taught us how to follow. Last week we talked about sheep. We're the sheep. He's the shepherd. He knows his sheep. He speaks to his sheep. We're to listen to his sheep and follow him. The call to us is to make changes, to change, to allow God to transform us. This week in our formation groups, we were talking about an exercise we did this week. When you wake up in the morning, instead of grabbing your phone and looking at the news and emails, pause for a second. Thank God. Think of him. Be grateful you're alive. Spend a moment with him. It changes us. It changes our day in a wonderful way. Well, we're studying the Gospels of what it means, and we're in Luke 19 of what it means to follow Jesus. And we've come to a story of a man named Zacchaeus. Now, Zacchaeus, the story of Zacchaeus, is no less a miracle than the feeding of 5,000. 5 loaves, 2 fish, boom. That's a lot of food. We're planning this Thanksgiving luncheon. That's a lot of food. 5,000, that's a lot of food. The story of Zacchaeus is no less a transformation than the paralyzed man who couldn't move his legs and they were healed. Or the blind man who couldn't see and then he could see. The story of Zacchaeus is a wonderful transformation story. And you may know the story of Zacchaeus. You may have learned it in Sunday school. Remember that song? Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up into a sycamore tree, for the Lord he wanted to see. And as the Lord went by that way, he looked up in the tree, and he said, Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today. That was a break. In the British Empire, it was, we're going to your house for tea, is how it ended. But Zacchaeus is named that by his parents. Naming is important. My name is Daniel. God is my judge. I remember that. Zacchaeus was named Zacchaeus. It meant to be bright, to be clean, to be pure, to be innocent. What an ironic name for Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector. He was bright, but he certainly wasn't pure. He was treated unclean by the Jews. And he certainly was not innocent. He was very devious. But that's Zacchaeus. He had a strong name, but he had 5 strikes against him. When I go through the store and I'm buying things at the grocery store and everyone has their name tag on them. And if I see a good name, I'll say, man, that's a strong name. Isaiah, Ezekiel, do you know what that means? Names are important. But here's Zacchaeus, 5 or 6 strikes against him. First, he was from the wrong city. The first line says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was chief tax collector and he was wealthy. Jericho, the wrong city. Jericho is best known for a disastrous story. When the children of Israel were moving into the promised land, they crossed the Jordan and the first city they hit was Jericho. And we remember what happened. They marched around it 7 times. On the 7th day, they marched around 7 times, blew the horns, and the walls came. So you remember that old spiritual. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. That's all we're going to do. Yeah, there's a lot of Sunday school people in here, right? When the walls came tumbling down, children of Israel went in. Joshua proclaimed a curse on Jericho, that all who would live and rebuild this city would be cursed. And here's Zacchaeus in Jericho. And it was rebuilt after the exile by the sons of Jericho, they called themselves. And it was known as the city of palms because there were so many palm trees, which means it was rich in palm oil. That was their commodity. They had a ton of money because of all the commodities in Jericho. And it was at the crossroads of many places. Up north now is Lebanon, but it was Tyre and Damascus. On the west was the Mediterranean, Caesarea, Joppa, the port cities. On the south was Egypt. It was a city where people came through, a lot of commerce, a lot of money for the tax gatherer. And Rome. Zacchaeus was a big man in a big city, and he loved it. He loved it all. Money was created, and he took it. Spurgeon said Zacchaeus belonged to a bad city of Jericho, a city which had been cursed. And it was known that God could never reach that side of town. That was the bad side of town. Don't go to Jericho. Remember our last church plant in Trinidad, we went to the other side of town. We had planted churches in many Hindu villages and many areas throughout Trinidad, but there was one side of town that the pastors I grew up with wouldn't go to was the rich side of town. Dan, they don't deserve a church. And we went into that side of town. And it was a very difficult situation going into that side of town without the support of all our friends and all our other churches, and planted a church. God brought a church there. And today, it's even on live stream. I can see it every Sunday morning. It's wonderful. But the wrong side of town, that was Jericho. Number 2, he was a tax collector. Although it wasn't a crime to collect taxes, in fact, taxation is a divine institution. Take a deep breath. But they were the most hated outcasts in all of Israel. And he was hated because, number 3, he was a crook and a cheat. That's what he was. The crime was in defrauding and extorting people, which usually went with the territory. They taxed everything people did and everything they had. They taxed every activity and every asset, and it was at the whim of a tax collector. Like in the days of Jeremiah, when the priests excelled in wickedness, tax collectors excelled in wickedness. That was Zacchaeus. Number 4, he was working for the hated Roman Empire. Empowered by the enemy, Rome ruled the Jews with an iron fist. They were slaves in their own country, and Zacchaeus represented them to the people. Number 5, he was hated. They couldn't stand the sight of him. He represented everything that was wrong and bad about their lives. If you had taken a poll that day in Jericho and said, name the most hated man of Jericho, Zacchaeus would have been up there. They didn't like him. Everyone would have said, this is the worst man in town. And if you asked him a second question, who is the least likely person who would want to see Jesus, they would say, Zacchaeus. He would not want to see Jesus. Top of the list. He was written off as a crooked tax collector long ago. And number 6, he was rich. An abundance of earthly possessions that exceeded normal experience. It separated him from everyone else, and everyone else saw that he had what he had off their backs. Wasn't a good situation. Zacchaeus was a bad guy. He was an unrepentant, professional sinner who worked for the enemy and cheated to make himself rich. That's Zacchaeus. Hopefully not your neighbor right now. He was a despised guy, but he was also desperate. Look at verse 3. He wanted to see who Jesus was. But because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. There was something in Zacchaeus that said, I need to see Jesus. It might have been he wanted to tell his grandkids, this guy, I saw him when he came by. There might have been something else. And maybe he thought, you know, I heard that Jesus called a guy named Levi, Matthew, a tax collector. And Matthew's following him. I wonder what this guy is like. Anyway, he wanted to see Jesus. He was probably only about 5 foot tall. That's pretty short. He stood on his tiptoes, but it didn't help. He started pushing, excuse me, excuse me. The crowd was like a solid wall of onlookers. You ever been to the Rose Parade? Yeah, it was like that. Just you couldn't see. If you're short, you got to get there very early in the morning. It was like a barbed wire fence. They wouldn't let him in. If they saw him, they'd probably spit on him. They hated this guy. Not in this parade. Not this year. Not any year are you going to see Jesus. They hated him. He couldn't fight his way through the crowd. So what did he do? He ran ahead. Probably not very good for a Roman representative, a government official, an older man to be running. Wasn't a good look. He didn't care. He ran, and he found a tree. He's desperate. He abandons all decorum. He climbs a tree. You don't see older people climbing trees anymore, do you? At least our wives tell us not to. But he wanted to see Jesus. He was broken. He had probably learned the hard way, one of the most basic lessons of life. You can be rich, but you can't be happy. You can be wealthy and not be loved. You can be successful and not be satisfied. What money can't buy, Zacchaeus had learned it well. He had three things that prevent salvation in most people: position, possessions, and problems. And he couldn't get past those. He looked like he had it all, but he had no hope, no eternal future, no love, no acceptance, except for an encounter with Jesus. In verse 5, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." When Jesus reached the spot, reminded me of Jesus meeting the woman at the well. I must go to Samaria. He had an appointment.